This summer, the Black Lives Matter protests filled the streets, forcing cities up and down the UK to reckon with a difficult side of their past. Protests in Edinburgh focused on the Melville monument.
One purpose only, and that's to destroy racism and to bring him down.
I do think we should have a long, hard look at this as a country.
The statue and the controversial man on top of it has been at the centre of a deeply personal battle for years.
Henry Dundas delayed the abolition of the slave trade. That is shameful.
I believe it should be a truthful and factual words that are written on the plaque in a way that would give someone reading it for the first time with zero knowledge the right idea of who it is who stands 150 foot above their heads.
This is the story of two families' lengthy fight to protect their ancestors' legacies.
The cruelties of the past are very important because they influence the way we live now.
Is the symbol taking the brunt for everything that happened back then?
And what does the fallout over this one statue tell us about Scotland's ability to reckon with its past?
Previous decisions shouldn't be judged by modern-day values and standards.
We can't know about ourselves and we can't relate with each other in a meaningful way unless we understand that I am a part of your history and you're a part of mine.
Hello, we saw you reading the sign. Australia.
And we saw who's an imposing statue of.
This is the Melville Monument. Towering over Edinburgh, it stands as a tribute to Henry Dundas, an 18th century Tory politician who was also known as the first Viscount Melville. He's a figure of great controversy because of his connections to the slave trade.
When I look at the plaque describing who he was and what he did, I thought, well, this doesn't say a lot about him. It does say his political positions, but it doesn't say really what he did. And I feel that a new plaque is required to say to people, well, this man played a significant role in slavery.
He was Lord of the Admiralty.
Sir Geoff Palmer was born in Jamaica and came to Britain as part of the Windrush generation. In 1989, he became Scotland's first black professor.
And governor.
He is a professor of science, but is equally passionate about educating people about our country's long history with slavery.
I'm from Jamaica.
Right.
So technically, I'm a slave descent.
Yeah, right.
A lot of Scottish people, when I do these lectures, they say, well, they've never heard of it, all the stuff I say.
The cruelties of the past are very important because they influence the way we live now. And if we can understand them, then we can actually change the way we behave today to make the future better.
Geoff has argued for years that there is not enough information for visitors here about Henry Dundas, the man standing on top of the Melville Monument.
The Scottish people are big enough to take their history, and they're big enough to be told that a Scottish person behaved badly.
This is deeply personal for the descendants of Henry Dundas too.
This is Arniston House, where the Dundases of Arniston now live, and I inherited it in 1970.
Henry Dundas was born and raised at Arniston House on the outskirts of Edinburgh. His descendant, Althea Dundas, now lives here and offers tours of the house with her daughter, Henrietta.
We're actually on the south side of the house, and you can see up in the pediment, but the Chief Baron, who was one of the Dundases, he had these stones brought out from the old Parliament House in Edinburgh, and you can see it's the Scottish coat of arms there.
Henry Dundas was a leading lawyer in Scotland before he rose to prominence as a politician in Westminster in the 18th century.
From the 1780s, he becomes a minister in the British government. Eventually, he becomes the Home Secretary and then the Secretary of State for War. And this is during the period when William Pitt the Younger was Prime Minister, and Dundas was one of his most important allies. He's part of the British establishment, very central to it, and I think by the 1790s, his motivation is about maintaining British power, and in particular British imperial power, and that's an empire that has been largely based on slavery.
In 1792, a politician named William Wilberforce proposed a bill in the House of Commons to immediately abolish the British slave trade. It is then that Henry Dundas made an intervention which Geoff believes prolonged the slave trade by 15 years.
In 1792, he decided to challenge William Wilberforce, who was trying to get the slave trade abolished, and Henry Dundas inserted the word gradual into the whole debate and got it carried. And that delayed the abolition of the slave trade.
Dundas's amendment was passed in the House of Commons. According to Geoff, this one act had devastating consequences.
It's about 630,000 slaves who were taken into slavery, who would not have been taken into slavery if Dundas hadn't said slavery had to be gradually abolished. That means the slave trade. And the fact that that's not on the present plaque is shameful.
Geoff has been asking the council for years to install a new plaque which includes a reference to Dundas's connections to the slave trade. But he's been met with resistance. The Dundas family completely disagree with Geoff's interpretation of their ancestor. They are insistent that it would be wrong for the wording on the plaque to state that their ancestor deliberately delayed the abolition of the slave trade.
It is simply untrue that my ancestor prolonged the slavery. He had very, very little to do with it. I feel the people that seem to be so determined to put out this message, that they are in the wrong.
In terms of the wording on the plaque for the statue being changed, it's factually incorrect that Henry was responsible. Effectively, he's been made out to be a mass murderer, and he was actually, in fact, in favour to abolish slavery, so he was an abolitionist.
The Dundas family do not agree that their ancestors' gradualist policy was a way of maintaining the slave trade.
His intention was to end slavery, but there had to be a political process. He was a politician. There was a pragmatic way he had to do this. And my understanding is that the only way that this could be done was by his gradual proposal. So I'm not ashamed of him. Our argument is that if he went with Wilberforce's original proposal, that it just would have been shot down altogether.
And there are things that Henry Dundas had to do when he was Home Secretary. I wish he hadn't had to do, but I recognise that he had the guts to have to do it. I mean, like our people in high places now, Nicola Sturgeon, etc., they have to make very, very difficult, very, very unpopular decisions. Can you remember?
They feel it's their duty to defend their ancestors' honour.
Very upsetting for the family, for your ancestor to be...
Yeah, we take it personally. I mean, we're very open about Henry. He had his faults, but someone's got to do the dirty work.
But also it boils down to he's being falsely accused of something.
It's the false accusation.
Yeah. And he's not here to defend himself. So as his ancestor, his family member, that's our duty to do that.
Bobby Melville is Althea's nephew and the 10th Viscount Melville. He was born in Scotland but moved to London as a child.
Okay. Have you just taken 6? Yep. I try and get back to Scotland as much as I can. I'm in love with the Highlands, with the history, the heritage, the buildings, the architecture, the people, the culture.
He runs expeditions through his adventure travel company, including here in Loch Lomond.
I think I've spent, at least from most of my life, doing things that I thought that maybe my previous ancestors and other people who I hold in high regard might respect me for and might judge me by in the right way.
Bobby has made it a lifelong mission to learn more about his ancestors.
For the last 28 years, I've been piecing together certain bits of information to learn about the history of my family. I've always been very proud about my title, ancestry, the clan Dundas. Previous decisions shouldn't be judged by modern-day values and standards. I believe it should be a truthful and factual words that are written on the plaque in a way that would give someone reading it for the first time with zero knowledge the right idea of who it is who stands 150 foot above their heads.
There's no doubt that the heated debate surrounding the Melville monument in Henry Dundas is symbolic of a much larger issue for Scotland. How does a country come to terms with its long history with slavery? Since the 17th century, slavery had been a cornerstone of the British Empire. The Act of Union in 1707 enabled Scottish merchants to expand their activities into English colonies.
Because Scotland was a poor country, that has a really transformative impact, perhaps more so than on England. So suddenly and increasingly over the 18th century, the Atlantic economy presents a lot of opportunities for Scottish people. And when we say the Atlantic economy, what we're talking about is an economy that is based on slavery.
Merchants made vast fortunes by enslaving African people and sending them to work on British colonies. The import of goods such as sugar, cotton and tobacco transformed Scotland's prosperity.
Glasgow is the biggest port that's importing tobacco, but then that extends beyond Glasgow across Scotland. Some people were able to rise a lot in social status, become quite wealthy, starting out as overseers or what was called bookkeepers, and eventually becoming landowners and the owners of enslaved people themselves.
But by the 1780s, there was growing unease with the slave trade.
You start to get an organised political movement that's calling for the abolition of the slave trade. And in particular, the tactic they used was the petition. Parliament is hearing evidence about the slave trade in particular and slavery more generally, and then that evidence is taken and packaged and published and people are reading it and talking about it. So this is a really lively debate, and it's one that people feel really passionate about.
It was in this context that William Wilberforce proposed his bill for the immediate abolition of the slave trade. This was amended by Henry Dundas. After years of debate, abolition of the slave trade finally happened in 1807. At 150 feet high, the Melville Monument towers over Edinburgh. With its prominent position on the skyline, it can't help but draw people's attention. Adam Ramsey is a journalist and activist who lives in Edinburgh.
I used to, walk past the Melville Monument every day, and people who would come and visit me would, go past it too, and sometimes they'd say, "Who's that guy?" And if you go and you look for a plaque telling you who he is, there's only one tiny little plaque which doesn't really give any real information about this guy's life. So I looked it up, and I was pretty horrified with what I found.
Adam went from being indifferent to being incensed, and he decided to take action.
I decided that the simplest thing to do would be to make a plaque. The plaque said, Henry Dundas, Viscount Melville, which was his title, the great tyrant, which is how people in Scotland knew him at the time. Because of him, the slave trade wasn't abolished for an extra 15 years. So it gave a sense that, perhaps he wasn't quite such a hero. And then it ended by saying, so that we remember who looks down on us. He's got what is basically the biggest statue in Edinburgh. We should at least begin to think about and, be honest about who these people who we commemorate at the heart of our capital city are.
His makeshift plaque was removed by the council, but Adam wasn't going to give up that easily.
I launched a petition asking the council to allow for a plaque at the bottom of the statue enumerating some of Dundas's crimes. And lots of people signed it very quickly, so we hit the quota very fast. And I went along to the petitions committee at the next meeting. There were some quibblings, but ultimately they all agreed that there should at least be a better plaque. So when I walked out of the council meeting, I was pretty excited. It felt like, we'd made real progress here.
The council accepted Adam's petition in 2016 and agreed there should be a new plaque. Adam then teamed up with Geoff to push for this to happen. A voice then quickly joined the other side of the highly charged debate. Michael Fry has written a biography about Henry Dundas and his life. Following Adam's successful petition, he began helping the Dundas family to propose an alternative wording for the plaque.
I heard that the City of Edinburgh Council wanted to renew or replace the inscription on the Dundas column in St Andrew's Square in Edinburgh. And naturally, I was concerned that the new inscription should, I would say, not take a political view of what Henry had done.
Michael believes that Geoff and his supporters are failing to consider the bigger picture of what was happening at the time.
This was all part of Dundas's work during a world war. And it was a very minor part of that. I mean, he was concerned about the security of the West Indies, and he judged that the immediate abolition of the slave trade would cause such unrest on the British sugar islands, as it was already producing on the French sugar islands, an awful lot of trouble.
1791 marked the beginning of the French Revolutionary Wars, in which Britain later became embroiled in a battle with France. The British government watched fearfully as they saw revolts across the French colonies, including in Haiti, which was known then as Saint-Domingue.
It was the richest colony. It was known as the Pearl of the Caribbean. It was also called the Eden of the Western world. But obviously, behind all these paradise features, everything was powered off the backs of slave labour.
The enslaved people in French-owned Haiti started an uprising. Afraid the rebellion might spread to British colonies, 2 years later, William Pitt and Henry Dundas sent thousands of troops to Haiti to try to quash the revolt and conquer the country.
It was an opportunity. So France was losing control of its prized possession. This is a period of imperialist treachery and machinations, and these superpowers of the day trying to get it back for themselves. So it's a very valuable colony. Haiti was spoken about as a warning and as what can happen if the enslaved are given freedom too early. One way to temper abolition was to make it a gradual process. As if the slaves weren't ready for it yet.
Michael believes that in this context, it was reasonable for Dundas to try and reach a compromise.
He was afraid the economy of the West Indies would collapse. It was essential that this should continue with as little disruption as possible, even while the slave trade was being abolished. The British government had no interest in taking idealistic action which would have damaged the West Indies economy. I can't see that would have been in anybody's interest.
For Michael, The political landscape of the time is a key consideration when looking at Dundas's decision.
Owning estates in the West Indies made people very rich. And with the money they earned from those plantations, they could buy themselves seats in Parliament, as was very common in those days. So, if you wanted to pass a bill abolishing the slave trade, you had to take account of the opposition in Parliament. Otherwise, you would lose your legislation. And, we see from the Brexit process today, it's very easy for governments to lose legislation when they haven't taken sufficient care to build up support for it. And Henry Dundas faced exactly the same situation in trying to get the gradual abolition of the slave trade.
Michael Fry and others also argue that Henry Dundas's involvement in a legal case 14 years earlier that clarified that slavery in Scotland should remain illegal showed Dundas's support for abolition. However, others argued this did nothing to stop slavery in the colonies. The division lines are clear, and there is a fierce debate about what should and shouldn't be included on the plaque. With a tight word limit, the two sides met in 2018 to try and find a compromise on what the wording should be.
I will not accept anything that is moderating and will moderate the truth. If you delay slavery from 1792 to 1807, 42,000 people transported a year, over 15 years, that's 630,000 people who would not have been transported if, in fact, the gradual bill did not come in 1792.
Well, what would you have wanted him to do? If he had introduced a bill for total abolition, it would have failed. It wouldn't have got through Parliament.
Well, that's not an issue. We talk about what got through.
Henry Dundas is not personally responsible for every sin of the British ruling class of his era, but he is the symbol that they chose to leave us. The question is a moral one. The question is, what do we think as modern Scotland about the fact that we built our wealth, including the glorious new town around us, by plundering, by transporting huge numbers of slaves across the world?
Slavery was rife throughout, before and after. It didn't stop, as far as I understand it, even when he died, when he came out of any power.
We are living the consequences of the past today. The symbols that we're left with are very important. And I don't want that statue taken down because it's part of my history. What we need to do is to be honest about what our history represents.
Is the symbol taking the brunt, if you will, for, rightly or wrongly, for everything that happened back then?
Well, I'm not trying to justify slavery or racial discrimination or anything of that kind. What I'm trying to do is to explain that different historical eras had different moralities.
I am sceptical of the idea that values have changed that much. This was a live debate at the time on which people took moral judgments. This isn't a question that no one asked.
Our slavery, British slavery in the Caribbean, and the slavery in the New World was chattel slavery, where a slave had no right to life. That's the law. That is what we continued for over 200 years. And therefore, anybody involved in prolonging that has that responsibility. That's why we need to have it absolutely clear so that we do not moderate it with ignorance.
With tensions increasingly high and no agreement in sight, the City of Edinburgh Council set up a series of meetings to discuss the highly contentious issue of what a new plaque should say. Ahead of a crucial meeting, both sides started gathering evidence to support their preferred wording. Geoff found a piece of evidence which, in his view, proves that Dundas was not an abolitionist.
I've got it written on a piece of paper which I carry with me because this is important to me. Because in Dundas's letter, in that building, written in 1796, he sat down and wrote this letter to Lord Courton. And he ended the letter by saying, "I have not time to write more. It is near 5, and I must go to oppose the proposition for the abolition of the slave trade. Henry Dundas.
He also found a quote on the issue from the Prime Minister at the time, William Pitt.
On the other side of my card, because these two statements from that history is so important to me, Pitt actually described gradual as an enormous evil. And it means by waiting for some contingency or by refusing to proceed till 1,000 favorable circumstances unite together, year after year escapes, and the most enormous evils go unredressed. That is what the Prime Minister, Pitt, said that gradual meant. It meant never. And I think that it is time that we put that on the plaque because it is true.
Geoff and his supporters wanted the plaque to clearly state that Dundas deliberately delayed the abolition of the slave trade. Instead, the Dundas family side wanted it to reflect that he was a pragmatic politician who was just doing what he needed to get the bill passed. In October 2018, they arrived at the city chambers to meet with the council to argue their case.
Geoff and I worked together to draft a kind of rewording of the proposed plaque that we then put to the rest of the committee. And I think it's fair to say that Bobby and Michael weren't very happy with it.
There's a lot of different views and opinions to include on a very small amount of words to put on the plaque. But I think what everyone's agreed on, which is undeniable, is that Henry Dundas, the first Viscount Melville, was a politician, and as a very practical, pragmatic man, he was, I think, very sensible in putting certain things in place to help ensure that slavery, the slave trade, was abolished. And I think his efforts helped towards that for the eventual abolition.
I've got differences, and these differences really need to be sorted out. And the essence is, my view remains the same as I said before, and I've always said, as long as the truth is on the plaque, people can interpret the truth any way they like. That's how our society works. Okay then, see you, bye-bye.
Almost 2 years after the meeting, no one had backed down. The council left the old plaque in place, and it looked like an agreement would never be found. Then an event thousands of miles away in the US changed everything.
Thousands of anti-racism protesters have attended rallies in Glasgow, Edinburgh and Aberdeen.
No justice!
The demonstrations were called after George Floyd died while being arrested by police in Minneapolis.
In Edinburgh, the Melville Monument became a focal point for the Black Lives Matter protest.
One purpose only, and that's to destroy racism and to bring him down.
Suddenly, all statues, monuments and buildings with names connected with the slave trade were thrust into the spotlight, becoming a political flashpoint.
I do think we should have a long, hard look, or perhaps not that long a look, but a hard look at this as a country. And the question I would start with is, why do we want to continue to have statues and celebrations and street names of people who profited in and traded in abject human misery? This is a big debate and long overdue debate.
Even with the risks posed by the coronavirus pandemic, Geoff felt that it was vitally important to seize the moment and join the protest.
A policeman, the law, is kneeling on a black person's neck. On his neck. for the sole reason that he's black. Now, how can we justify that?
But despite the groundswell of anger, in early June, Edinburgh Council issued a statement saying they would not be holding any further meetings about a new plaque. A decision which led to outrage from many involved in the Black Lives Matter movement.
When George Floyd died, in that horrific manner, and the public reacted, and it was after that, I heard nothing from the council, nothing. And the whole world was reacting. The world will recognize that for no reason other than having a black skin, they were enslaved for hundreds of years, beaten and killed. I felt it was important. So I went and I spoke, and I spoke firmly about the fact that I felt the day is a day when my ancestors would like to thank everybody who was there for coming out today in support of, the life of black people. I was thinking about the Dundas statue was part of the story of enslavement. It was part of the story that said black lives didn't matter. It was an opportunity for me to inform the public, because I feel that a lack of education has driven racism, and that ignorance is now into our culture. It's the way people behave. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart on behalf of all those people who were killed for no difference other than for a pigment. Thank you very much.
On the very same day as the Edinburgh protest, demonstrators in Bristol tore down a statue of another politician with connections to the slave trade. Edward Colston was the deputy governor of the Royal African Company, which had a monopoly on the slave trade in the 17th century. The protesters threw his statue into the harbour, prompting a strong reaction from the UK government.
Sheer vandalism and disorder completely is unacceptable, and it's right actually the police follow up on that and make sure that justice is undertaken with those individuals that are responsible for such disorderly and lawless behaviour.
Councillor Cleo Lake is the former Lord Mayor of Bristol.
Colston was a real elite, powerful man in the city of Bristol, built up his wealth from a variety of sources. With wealth, as we see today, comes power and a huge say in the direction of the city. He was the CEO signing off this lucrative business for them, but a human catastrophe and misery for the victims.
Just like in Edinburgh, activists there had been in a protracted battle with Bristol City Council over the statue.
We tried petitions, we tried questions in at Cabinet and full council, all these different things, press releases, etc., etc. If it hadn't have been for George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, the statue would still be there, we'd still be arguing, we'd still be asking for it to be taken down or contextualised, be put in a museum, and we would still be largely ignored. After such a long time of campaigning, to suddenly see he's out, he's down, he's been put back in that river, and it's powerful.
The events unfolding in Bristol upped the ante in Edinburgh. The Melville monument was graffitied, and an anonymous activist group replaced signs across the city to highlight connections to the slave trade. This caught the attention of local residents.
I didn't know this was happening.
Me too. Emancipation, no?
Right.
Freedom.
Yeah.
It's meant.
Oh my gosh, I didn't know this.
Good.
Wow, that's good. I didn't know that.
Some protesters felt that Geoff wasn't going far enough in seeking a change in the plaque.
Now this guy, Henry Dundas, he delayed the abolition of slavery for 15 years. We don't want that statue being there, and I would like for it to be taken down.
They called for the statue to be removed permanently.
Geoff's done a lot, and if Geoff's stopping at that, that's fine. I think it's now time for us to carry on that and see if we can get Dundas down. I mean, since I was a kid, I've known my history. 630,000 lives. It could have been free. So that's where I stand with that. I just don't believe Dundas should be there.
Even the whole new town was built on slavery. Like, there's so many things that is a constant reminder. Like, yes, we can't demolish all the buildings, we can't change anything, but for the things we can, even if there's black people that want to go and see them, we know there's there, and at least when they're in the museums, have the correct meaning for what they are and have the correct explanation, not just something like, oh, this is Sir Dundas, he was a really good person and whatever.
As protests and direct action escalated, pressure built on the City of Edinburgh Council to take action. And two surprising voices joined the debate. In June, Benjamin Carey, who is a direct descendant of Henry Dundas, joined calls for a new plaque, speaking out against his relatives' proposed wording.
I'm aware that the current Viscount Melville has put together a committee to defend the name of our ancestor. And from what I have read from professional historians, I'm afraid I don't see that the view is correct. I think it's very important to keep statues of controversial people and to interpret them honestly. I think it is not true that he was an abolitionist.
Benjamin lives near Comrie, a village in Perthshire with its own monument to Henry Dundas.
The legacy of Henry Dundas in this village is you have Melville Square, that's connected with Dunera Street, which is the name of the estate, and then you have Dundas Street. So it's all throughout the village, there is the history of Henry Dundas, Viscount Melville.
Benjamin felt he needed to speak out after the council's refusal to continue the debate about the plaque.
I was astonished that the City of Edinburgh was not engaging and was basically stopping the discussion. And I said that they really needed to think about how they're approaching this and really to embrace Henry Dundas, warts and all. He was a desperately important historical figure, but he was a person of his time, and there were many things he did that were legal, but they weren't right. And so I was very keen that the new plaque should represent the full picture of what he did and what he represents.
Not long after Benjamin Carey published a letter outlining his views, another surprising figure joined the debate. One of Scotland's most eminent historians gave the Dundas family's argument a boost. Sir Tom Devine had previously written that by arguing for gradual abolition of the slave trade, Henry Dundas effectively killed off reform for a generation. But now he has a different view of Henry Dundas's significance.
Dundas, to some extent, has been scapegoated because the fundamental reasons why the slave trade was not abolished until 1807 had little or nothing to do with his manoeuvrings. He was absolutely typical of the government to which he belonged. The strategic, economic, and military reasons for anti-abolitionism were so powerful that no one single person would have any significance. I've tried to place Dundas, and indeed the whole debate about the continuation of slavery, in a much wider context, in a global context historically in the 1790s. And having done so, I have come to the conclusion that the end of the slave trade in the British Empire by British government decision in the 1790s was well nigh impossible. And that Dundas's role in this was either non-existent or peripheral.
His change of view surprised the academic community.
All the distinguished historians who have looked at this topic see Dundas as one of the critical people who made it harder to get an abolition of the slave trade through. I think it's really important that historians use all the evidence we can to show the complex humanity of people who lived through enslavement and slavery. And I do think sometimes in these discussions about this or that law that could be made, that aspect is left out or forgotten.
The debate between historians demonstrates just how difficult it is for a country to agree on a singular truth about its history. And as the divisions deepened in Scotland during the summer, the Black Lives Matter movement was taking Canada by storm too.
We're going to move across Dundas and back up Bay.
Such was Henry Dundas's reach and power. There are several prominent streets named after him in Toronto, including Dundas Street. In July, a petition was started calling for it to be renamed, receiving 14,000 signatures. Melanie Newton is a professor of history at the University of Toronto, specialising in the history of the Caribbean.
Currently, the City of Toronto are really looking at the ways in which not just Dundas Street, but a lot of the city streetscape really glorifies colonialism and racism. And Dundas himself, he didn't play much of a role in any positive way in the history of Canada or Ontario. Other than that, he was a very powerful imperial official at the time. He was a pivotal figure in some of the most violent aspects of British imperialist expansionism, and that he himself does not seem to have played very much of a role in Canada's history.
The controversy caught the attention of lawyer and prosecutor Jennifer Dundas. No relation to the family, she first heard about her namesake's connections with the slave trade when the Black Lives Matter protests started.
All of a sudden there's this news that there's someone with the last name Dundas who's associated with promoting slavery or delaying abolition. And I just felt compelled to investigate this to find out what was going on, because my name will always be associated with this. It's had such a high profile that I needed to know what the truth was about this.
Jennifer started compiling a research document.
What I discovered was there's a whole other story about what he was doing at that time. And the more I looked at it, the less logical the arguments seemed around building a case for him as someone who delayed abolition of the slave trade.
Jennifer questions some of the arguments Geoff and his supporters have made.
We believe he has drastically oversimplified and actually distorted the issue with regard to what happened when Henry Dundas introduced the amendment for gradual abolition. There were so many things that were preventing abolition, immediate abolition, from being possible. It is simply a fallacy to say that Henry Dundas's amendment caused it.
She also challenges Geoff's interpretation of the letter he found, which Dundas sent to a friend before he went to a debate. In it, Dundas signs off by saying, he must go to oppose the proposition for the abolition of the slave trade.
He did not say in that letter he was going to vote against abolition. What he said was he was going to oppose the proposals for abolition. And that's what he did. So this letter is entirely consistent with what he said throughout his involvement with this issue, which is that it should be done incrementally. Otherwise, the whole venture will fail.
Jennifer has sent her research document to decision makers in Canada and in Scotland for their consideration.
Bringing a degree of skepticism to what historians who are lining up against Henry Dundas are saying is a useful thing to do in this debate. Our allegiance is not to the reputation of Henry Dundas. My primary loyalty, my primary interest is in the truth, is in the facts and the evidence and what those facts and evidence show.
Professor Newton has seen Jennifer's document and questions the veracity of her research.
In a whole range of ways, the document reflects the fact that they arrived at their conclusion to start with, that they were going to defend this man, and then brought to their research that assumption.
As in Scotland, Professor Newton believes that the ongoing debates about streets and statues are symbolic of something much bigger.
I'm not saying that, if Dundas Street continues to be Dundas Street in Toronto, or, the Melville Monument remains standing with or without a plaque in Scotland, that the human community of democracy is going to be won or lost. But it is, I think, reflective of how fundamental and how existential some of those debates are.
In the face of mounting criticism in Scotland and abroad, the City of Edinburgh Council changed its mind. Leader Adam McVeigh immediately agreed a new wording for a temporary plaque which had caused years of contention, with a permanent plaque to follow.
When we saw the comments by Sir Geoff Palmer at the Black Lives Matter protest that this, just a simple thing of telling the story of Henry Dundas more accurately, had taken years, it seemed absolutely inexcusable that it should take that length of time.
Not only will the new plaque mention Dundas's role in the slave trade, it will go further. The Melville Monument will now be dedicated to more than 500,000 Africans whose enslavement was a consequence of Henry Dundas's actions.
The important thing is that right now we start to tell the story, and we start to tell it accurately, not just about the man Henry Dundas, but about his role and indeed the city's role in the slave trade. This is about the entire city coming to terms with our own history. We have to work out what's best for us as a city, but as a bare minimum, and it is a bare minimum, we need to tell the story attached to these monuments and these historical figures more accurately.
Just weeks later, a temporary information board was put up, whilst the council prepared a permanent plaque. Geoff finally saw the fruits of his labour.
I'm not an emotional sort of person, but I thought this was a great achievement, not just for Edinburgh Council, who did it, but it was an achievement for all the millions of people who died. I think, I don't know of many memorials to slavery. And to feel that I was a part of this memorial, I think it was quite emotional in that sense. I will bring my family, not just my grandchildren. I'll bring my wife and I even get my daughters, because I want everybody to see that a lot of things in life are possible, but they can only sometimes come true if you have the help of the system.
But unsurprisingly, not all were happy about this sudden decision. Bobby and his supporters wrote a letter to the council demanding that the temporary plaque be removed.
It's quite obvious that the council felt like, or at least the leader felt like, he had to act to placate the situation. It's very easy to point at a statue that's 150, that's huge. It takes up, the centre focal point of St Andrew's Square. It's a perfect target. It's vitally important that our history is not revised or changed, or certain parts of it are pulled out to suit current modern agendas.
Bobby's letter triggered a strong response. Councillor Graham Campbell is part of the Black Lives Matter movement.
Oh, that's just a joke, isn't it? Edinburgh Council have allowed biased, historically inaccurate and defamatory information to be placed on the temporary plaques that commemorate the legacy of Henry Dundas. Well, he's dead, he can't be defamed. And it's historically accurate. The fact is, we've been telling a fake history for all this time that the false plaque has been up there. And his comments on Black Lives Matter, he doesn't support Black Lives Matter. He can't possibly do if he doesn't understand the historical necessity of that role that his ancestor played. Not only do we think it's great that the plaque has been changed, it's about time.
Henry Dundas would have been supportive today of the Black Lives Matter movement. Why he's being tied up as a scapegoat and vilifying him as an easy target for the Black Lives Matter movement is ridiculous. He was against slavery. So it's a disservice to a movement who, quite frankly, if they were told all of the information and not sort of information that's been passed around on social media, they would create their own view, I think, that he did a lot to support.
The date on this one, 17.
Other members of the Dundas family felt that the Melville Monument was being unfairly targeted by the Black Lives Matter movement.
It's misinformation that's been put out there. Henry Dundas wasn't responsible for the further 500,000 lives.
And it goes up every time.
Yeah, it's all linked, but it's separate issues. It's about defamation. He's being falsely accused of something that's not correct.
And I think it's doing a disservice to Black Lives Matter. It's got into sensationalising, and I wouldn't have thought that's helpful to the Black Lives Matter movement.
The introduction of the temporary plaque and an end to formal meetings saw the debate turn increasingly ugly. Personal attacks quickly spread across social media, many from anonymous accounts. So who was behind these attacks? BBC journalist Mariana Spring specialises in disinformation and social media. She has been analysing these accounts.
With this polarised debate online about the Melville Monument, something that we've noticed is the difference between the conversation happening online on either side of the debate. When it comes to those who argue that he was not an abolitionist, that the plaque needed to be put up on the statue, we notice that the conversation tends to be historians or other pro-Black Lives Matter protesters and campaigners, but that all appears to be authentic. On the other side of the debate, those who argue that Henry Dundas was an abolitionist and that the plaque should be removed, we see these examples of inauthentic accounts. They exclusively talk about this particular debate about this statue. It's that focus on a singular topic of conversation by accounts which have been newly established and newly set up, for which we can't find any other obvious background information to suggest who they are or who's running them, that would indicate that they are involved in some kind of platform manipulation or seeking to change the conversation.
Strong words are exchanged on both sides, especially from users arguing against the plaque, some of whom have been removed from Twitter for their actions.
It's often as a consequence of targeted harassment that social media sites do act and remove accounts. We've seen instances of some of the accounts involved in this particular campaign being removed. It's not just about manipulating the conversation, but actually targeting those who disagree with you. And that's something we've definitely seen in this case.
The personal attacks had a big impact on both Geoff and Bobby.
I got tremendous attacks. It's about trying to negate the truth or what you're saying. And therefore, it is all designed to get the support of the public. So they will put out information that is wrong, and then they will make derogatory statements. I don't think that trying to denigrate me is going to silence me. It's just absolute nonsense. And I just wish they come to their senses and realize that the truth will out.
I think it's really healthy for people to have a debate on a public platform such as social media to discuss their views and share information and have a healthy, courteous and friendly conversation through those means. I think what is not right, and which is a shame, is some incoherent slurs that are aimed at myself and others, even accusing me and others of being racist for not sharing views of other people. And I think that's a big shame because we're all entitled to our own opinion.
4 years after the debate about the Melville Monument first started, passions are as high as ever on both sides.
If the City of Edinburgh Council went ahead with the current wording and put it on the plaque, on the statue, I think that would be terrible. That would be a horrendous decision, and I think that would open up the doors for revisionists around the world to start changing history.
and adapting it for their own agendas. And I would think it would set a very dangerous precedent. I think it would be a massive shame, and I'd be upset and disappointed that the right, truthful wording wasn't put on.
It's a commemoration of the lives of people who suffered as property when they were people, and thus no human life should be bought or sold. And anybody who still feels that was acceptable because it was the time, there is never a time to buy and sell people. The descendant of Henry Dundas. Now, I respect his views, and therefore he's got a right to protest. However, I've not seen his evidence.
Despite Bobby's protests, the council is sticking to its guns on the wording and saying the debate about this one statue is over.
I have very little interest in continuing the discussion about one plaque and a statue. What interests me is having a much broader conversation about the many monuments that are in our city and what we should do with them and how we should tell the story of them. Because for better or worse, they're there. For better or worse, they're part of our history. Whether we remove them and put them in a museum, whether we keep them up, whether we add plaques, whatever we do, the history will still be there. And it's important that we understand that history. It's relevant to society now in understanding some of the systemic problems of racism that still exist within Edinburgh, within Scotland, within the entire world.
But the wider discussion about Scotland's role in slavery and how we should recognise that as a country continues.
Everyone is entitled to their view. That's what makes history so fascinating, is that you can read up on it and form your own opinion. Debate is healthy. Hopefully it will get people to search for the truth on any matter.
This history is not about recrimination. It's about living together as one people, one nation.
We can't change the past, but we can change the consequences, such as racism, for the better.